Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable. Actually, whether Trump wins or whether Kamala wins, the rubber is about to meet the road in a very big way. Either we've sort of taken a good hard look at the 1619 left and the DEI agenda, and we've just thoroughly repudiated it in Trump, or we've actually plunked for it in Kamala, and then they will actually try to jail their political opponents in a much bigger way than they have yet. And things will get, I'm not saying that things will get violent, but things will get serious in a very grim way. I think either one of those results is going to be more decisive than perhaps we're worried about. I know the right's very worried about theft. I know that we're generally very worried about riots in the streets. I could be wrong. I hate making predictions, so I probably will be wrong. But I suspect that the country is kind of all rioted out. I think on the left, especially, like you can only get so excited about transgender surgeries for minors that you burn cop cars about it or whatever it is that they like to do. You can only do that for so long. The leadership is very eager to keep the threat of political violence hanging in the air. I don't sense that that's something people at large in America are really excited about doing. It was always kind of an artificial neo-commie tactic. Hello and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at the American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Klavan, garbage editor, not to say garbage human, editor of the American Mind and associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books. I am joined this week by managing editor Mike Sabo and president and publisher Ryan Williams. Ryan, last week I learned something very important grammatically about how you and I conceive of the title of this podcast slightly differently, because you called it the Editors and Publisher Podcast, indicating that there's only one publisher, but there are two editors, and suggesting that the construction should be noun. It's a noun compound. Whereas I always say editors and publishers podcast because I always thought it was a possessive, as in belonging to the editors and to the publisher. So perhaps we should resolve this dispute off air. This may not be the most interesting conversation.
I think it was just like occasionally you think you're having a quick on the spot galaxy brain moment, but actually it just confuses things. That's probably what I did. So editors and publishers is fine. But I mean, it's funny you should bring up the importance of an apostrophe given the supporters are garbage, which we'll get to.
We've learned the importance of really hammering out with great clarity the position of apostrophes. So I'm glad we've got our apostrophes in a row, unlike President Biden, who is in fact still the president. I don't know if you guys remember this or not, but we were finally reminded of it in perhaps the worst possible way for Kamala Harris. But we have to build up to it a little bit here because we haven't even talked yet about the Madison Square Garden Trump rally. Over the weekend, Trump, much like the Nazis of 1939, I'll have you know, hosted a rally at Madison Square Garden. This was immediately seized upon as some kind of chilling echo of the Nazis, the fascists, the somethings. I mean, it was just folded into, I think it's fair to say, the ambient Hitler is Nazi, is fascist, is Trump, quasi pseudo argument that's been resurrected now in full force. I would say, and maybe I'll have to eat my words, but I feel that we are facing the final boss form of this mode of rhetoric because there's so little else for the Kamala / Walz campaign to rely upon in these closing, waning hours as we're less than a week out now from the election. It's really the only October surprise they seem to have is just that Trump is Hitler. And that's what they're going with. They attempted to fold this Madison Square Garden rally into that, neglecting the fact that any number of prominent Democrat figures have also hosted rallies there. And that also it's a major convention center in New York. So if you wanted to have a big event there in New York, you would probably go to Madison Square Garden. It looked to me, from not having gone, it looked from the outside like a pretty standard Trump rally. Energy high, mood good, vibes on point. It's been a good couple of weeks for the Trump campaign, and it showed. There was one other little fillip or gaffe that could have emerged were it not for subsequent events, and that is the opening comedic act. Tony Hinchcliffe, I believe is how you say his name. I'm not really familiar with his work up to this point, but they had him on kind of to open for Trump. He made a bunch of jokes. Some of them were racial stereotype jokes, and one of those jokes included calling Puerto Rico a garbage island. I thought I would get through it with a straight face, but it's not that funny, and the audience didn't laugh that hard. But it to me, there's a hilarity just to the fact that now we're talking about the phrase "garbage island," which is kind of like it's the sort of thing that we would yuck about in the hours before we start recording on this podcast. Like it feels like maybe better material for hanging out with the bros than with opening the giant Trump rally that constitutes his closing argument for his presidency. I don't know. I hesitate even to comment on its being off color because it was then so wildly blown out of proportion as yet further evidence that this was a racist hate rally. I mean, AOC came out, talked about what a hideous, contemptible thing this was. All sorts of Democrat figures were marshaled to the cause in the wake of this supposedly heinous act on the part of this comedian, including your old pal, Joe Biden, who was speaking to a group of Latino voters and he said, they've got this guy. Well, first of all, reading this off the CNN website, it's amazing how they've started to transcribe Biden accurately now that they're allowed to admit that he is senile. And especially now that they really want to play up this not having been something serious that he said, but just a mistake that he made in his sort of haze of dementia. They've really emphasized his weird stuttering way of speaking in the transcript here. He says, just the other day, a speaker at his rally called Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage. Well, let me tell you something. I don't know the Puerto Rican that I know, or Puerto Rico where I'm in my home state of Delaware. They're good, decent, honorable people. And then he went on to say, the only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters. Now, unlike the floating island of garbage comment, which is not only obviously a joke, but literally spoken by a comedian and genuinely does not reflect anything that Donald Trump feels about Puerto Ricans or Hispanics more generally, and is basically a nothing. This comment, I think, is a perfectly lucid and direct expression of exactly what Joe Biden and the Democrats think about Trump supporters, and it has caught on accordingly. I must imagine that there is absolute panic within the Democrat ranks right now as people try to figure out how to scramble around this. Kamala herself gave her closing argument, which was totally overshadowed by this. And now this must have been just old Joe going rogue, right? I mean, is there any reason you guys think that they would have done this on purpose? Is this to distract from Kamala herself, or is this as bad for them as it looks?
No, I think it's pretty hard to make the case that this was on purpose. Just, somehow Biden playing 3D chess to get his revenge on his replacement. And remember, there was that Obama-Biden exchange at the National Cathedral, which we didn't have audio for. And the New York Post hired a lip reader, and Biden said, I'm stronger than her. And Obama, this was maybe 2 weeks ago. And Obama said, yeah, you're right. There's still time. No, I think Biden genuinely sort of muffed it up. But in recent weeks, his gaffes, the one before this was where I think he also sort of misspoke or got ahead of himself and said something he didn't really mean to say, or he wouldn't have said had he been a little more in possession of his faculties a few years ago, which was he said, we got to lock him up about Trump. So echoing again, a 2016 scandal on the other side with the left getting outraged by Trump's fans chanting "lock her up" about Hillary. So no, I mean, I think it was an honest mistake, but it was a providential one for the Trump campaign. And Trump was giving a rally at the time, and Marco Rubio was there, and he saw it and brought it up in real time. And then Trump, with his world historical sense for blood in the water, immediately said, garbage, wow, garbage, yeah. Then he said, but don't blame Joe. He know not whateth he speak or something like that. So Trump immediately made a thing out of it. They sent an email out, which was perfect in a way, saying, I don't think you're garbage. I love you. And you're all extraordinary. And then Trump had a tweet. It was not another retruth, although I think he put it on Truth Social too. But now that he's back on Twitter, where he just said, you can't be president of this country if you don't love all Americans. And so it's just a golden opportunity. It's now completely overshadowed Kamala's closing argument, which ironically, if you take her at her word in her closing argument, which was Trump's a threat to democracy, he's an incipient fascist, he's going to take away your rights. I mean, the implication is if anyone votes for that, they are un-American garbage. So it's sort of consonant with Biden's slip. But, sometimes October surprises come in interesting packages. And this is one I think they're going to make a lot of hay out of. I just got a text from our friend, which I'll leave nameless because I didn't ask. But he said his suggestion was, so closing few days, new Trump campaign bus is a garbage truck that just goes around all the swing states.
I think I'm definitely with Ryan. I mean, the idea that Biden played 16D chess with this is just absurd. He obviously misspoke. The problem is though, it was a misspeak, but that's clearly what the Democrats actually believe of half the country, or even possibly even more than half of the country. Misogynist, racist. I mean, just go down all the isms. That's what they honestly think. So it's just hard walking it back. I think they really think that they had something with the whole Trump Madison Square Garden thing, fascism, Nazism. I mean, the same things that they've been bringing up over and over and over again. I think they possibly thought it would stick this time. And then Biden just absolutely puts his entire foot in his mouth and kind of wrecks it for them. So it's kind of sweet justice, honestly, for just the silliness of and really the disgusting kind of nature of their rhetoric and what they've been trying to do for a long time. Just tar and feather everybody they don't like as fascists and Nazis. I think Kamala said, somebody asked her about, do you really think that people who disagree with you are Nazis? And she said, well, of course not. Well, Tim Walz, I think, joined Hillary Clinton the other day in expressly basically saying that, this 1939 rally, same thing going on in 2024, which is just, this stuff needs to stop. The only thing that can happen is if these people lose, are shamed, leave office, and hopefully that will happen. We'll see in next week, or maybe even possibly in the weeks that follow, depending on how long it takes for ballots and so forth to actually get checked, especially in states like Arizona and elsewhere. I think Pennsylvania, maybe they're hopefully going to be a little bit faster. But so this is a problem. And the only way that really this is going to stop is saying, no more of this. We're not going to allow this kind of stuff anymore. It's beneath us and we have to go forward.
And I just recall the great late libertarian-ish political and comedic wit PG O'Rourke, I think at one point defined a gaffe as when a politician accidentally tells the truth. So I think that's definitely in this category.
Oh, absolutely.
That's almost exactly what I was about to say. But of course, Rourke said it better than I would have. I was thinking like, there's the kind of gaffe where you say what you don't mean, and it's bad because you've expressed yourself poorly or you've come up with something that you didn't want to say. And then there's the kind of gaffe where you say what you do mean, and it's bad because you were trying to talk around what you actually think. And this is definitely that. And that's, I think, why it is landing. I mean, there is an intangible element to this that the stars are just kind of aligning. For a while, they were aligning for Kamala, and now they're aligning against her, and everything's going wrong. But it's not so mysterious in that this is what was always bound to happen eventually, because Kamala herself is a contemptible human being who hates everybody who disagrees with her and wants to silence her opposition and knows nothing about, nor cares nothing about, the Constitution. So at some point that was going to make itself apparent. The question of this race, ever since Biden has dropped out, has really been, will it become apparent quickly enough and to enough people in time for the presidential election, or will it only become apparent when it's too late, when people have voted her in on the basis of coconut juice alone? And it seems like that question will remain hanging in the air right up until Tuesday. It certainly is possible that this is now becoming unavoidable, impossible, even for the hard libs to ignore what a terrible candidate she is. But there is still this enormous apparatus behind her that cares nothing about anything except for power and will vote for her, even though she says, or perhaps because she thinks in her heart of hearts, that Biden is right, that in fact half the country or more is garbage. And the minute you dissent from her point of view, you too will become garbage and she'll treat you as such. Like, I think we're getting, I used to think that we deserved the Ron DeSantis versus Gavin Newsom election, but we got the Kamala Harris, Donald Trump election. And now I'm not so sure. Now I think maybe this is the election we deserve. It might not be the election I want, but it is in some weird way the election that expresses our current conflict between sort of empty bureaucrat, machine politician designed effectively as a conduit for the will of much more shadowy forces and bureaucratic operators versus like the raw expression of American id, which is admittedly messy and uncouth and sort of impolitic at many points, but fundamentally has its heart in the right place. Like, that's sort of what the Trump movement is looking like to me at this last moment, is this good-natured, shambling, lumbering behemoth that is, we hope, will now stampede over these desiccated corpses who are really starting to lose steam. So I don't know. We'll see. It's going to come down to the wire.
Without, of course, endorsing anyone, which we don't do, I'll just make maybe a more positive case for at least the prospects of a second Trump administration, in the sense that, having learned all the lessons from the first in terms of personnel and the hostility of the establishment and the great challenge of the security bureaucratic state that has been dubbed the deep state, as well as the just bureaucratic, normal domestic operation of bureaucracy, I think at least the first year, if not the first 6 months of the next Trump administration, may be in a position to do more for the return to the American founders' constitutionalism than we have done in a long time, perhaps even than we had the chance to do in the 80s, given the sort of aggressive and radical agenda of the left since the 80s and its the impression it's made on a lot of normal Americans. So I know you mostly agree with all that, Spencer. I don't mean to really disagree with you, but no, it's exciting. And I think it's to say just a word in defense of both Kamala and Trump voters at the same time. You know, in many ways, the American people in their voting booth are a lot better than the cumulative choices they have in front of them, especially as those choices are filtered through a media establishment that is quite dishonest and tendentious at almost every turn. I mean, the reaction to the Madison Square Garden rally by the likes of CNN and MSNBC is frankly a scandal and shameful. They didn't send anyone down there to go look at the whole thing. It was just, this place is where a Nazi rally took place. QED, these people are terrible. Someone on Twitter had the other response as well. I mean, Kamala is giving a speech on the Ellipse. The KKK had a rally there at one point. So, how are we going to play this game? This is so stupid. The voters on both sides are better than their elites, however misled some of us may think on the left. And they have maybe a divergent understanding than we do, and many of Trump's voters do, for what American government should do. But I hope this is the beginning of a new birth of freedom, in the sense of this accumulated distrust and hate of our federal establishment, and in many ways the bipartisan ruling class, by normal Americans. I hope we're at a breakthrough moment for some kind of new politics after this. It may take a few years, maybe a subsequent administration, perhaps a subsequent Vance administration, for this to fully sink in for a lot of Americans, and maybe, I hope, even a solid and governing majority of them going forward, a realigning majority of them going forward. But I think there's a lot of reason for hope if the result on Tuesday is what it appears like it is very likely to be, given just the shift in momentum, the shift in the vibes, forgive me, and just the energy around one side of this fight. I'll just shut up after I say one more thing. We all have anecdata so far about folks around the country voting, and I have a dear friend who I've known for a long time who just voted in Austin this morning, Austin, Texas, and he said the place was buzzing. And I suspect the place was buzzing for reasons other than the half the country is fascist has finally caught everyone's attention and won the day.
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of that, Ryan, and I would add a note of hopefulness about the press. I think we haven't taken stock yet of this, even though we've noted it. There have been major and epoch-changing developments when it comes to the public's trust of the legacy media, and not just their sort of intellectual propositional sense that the big networks are untrustworthy, but their actual experiential internalized realization that these guys are lying and lying about lying and lying through their teeth about lying about lying. Really starting, I guess, with the Hunter Biden laptop revelations, but then compounded by the shameless about face on Biden's age over the course of about 24 hours after the debate, followed then by just the deeply astroturfed initial Kamala rollout. And now I think weirdly significant, the Trump Rogan interview, which he sat down for 3 hours and gave a more revealing interview than any debate I've seen, including a debate featuring Trump. These are not foregone conclusions. I'm not saying that this means now our media problem is solved, especially because if Kamala does win, you end up, I think, and many of our writers on the site have been arguing this, you end up with a really formidable censorship regime that will solidify its gains in a very big way and start to look a lot more like what you have already going on in Europe in the digital sphere. But if Trump wins, and if there's real follow through and commitment on the part of Musk and his supporters to fostering an actual platform where people actually say things without restrictions to one another, and if that continues, if politicians like Trump continue to make use of those platforms as their maybe even primary conduit to the people, the way that Trump's been going on podcasts, I think Vance is going on Rogan too later down the line. If that happens, then we actually are approaching something like a tipping point in the transition that is coming, no matter whether we like it or not. The transition from old media to digital media. We've always known that's on its way. It's only ever been a question of how that transition will look and how it will be managed. And there's a lot of reasons to be hopeful, I think, for the progress that's been made in that domain over the last several months. And that would also change everything. That would just completely rearrange the playing field, even for liberals, even in the sense of having a healthy two-sided dispute in this country again, which we haven't had for a long time, between people that generally agree on a few first principles, but can sort of argue back and forth about the right approach to those principles. So yeah, we shall see, but I too have a lot of hope. Let's now, since this is our last podcast before we actually leap off this precipice and this cliff, I wanted to give us a chance to take stock of this election season. We are obviously going to be running pieces at the American Mind at americanmind.org right up until the very last moment. But the three of us have kind of, it's funny, Mike, you came onto the podcast like right as the election season really heated up. And so our first season together as a podcast crew has basically been the eventual rise, the gradual rising of this election to eclipse all other news stories. A lot can happen. A week is a long time in politics, and God forbid, but we may also still be counting votes like days and days or a month after the election. So it's not like the next time we see each other, we will definitely be in a brand new world. But tell me your thoughts. I mean, how do you feel this like final week of the election is shaping up? Are you as bullish as Ryan seems to be? Are you a little more cautious? What's your
It's funny because I was probably actually a little bit more bullish, I don't know, probably about a month ago. I mean, I'm still optimistic, but you look at Real Clear Politics, their polling averages, you look at kind of swing state polling, and I mean, it's close. I still think Trump's going to do it. I think he's going to pull it out. I think it could be one of those things where it seems close, but it is actually not close at all. Again, I'm sure I've said this a bunch of times already. You look at where Hillary was at in 2016, Joe Biden was at in 2020. They were way far ahead of where Kamala's at right now. But you just never know. I mean, I've seen things where maybe polling's gotten that much better, which I kind of doubt. But, maybe they've made some improvements here or there where this is actually much closer to what is actually happening on the ground. But in any event, just what I've seen just anecdotally, just even around Cincinnati where I live, Trump signs, Vance signs, images, I mean, all kind of things going on when we go to visit my wife's in-laws up in Michigan. Same thing up there too. You have road signs, all kind of stuff. I think I've seen, I can count on my hand, I think the number of Harris walled signs that I've seen in my area. Obviously, Cincinnati, Hamilton County excluded, is a very conservative red area. So that makes sense, Butler County especially. But I just keep seeing that over and over again. And I hear that from friends who are basically all over the US. They see the same thing. There is an energy for Trump that is just not quite matched by the other side. We'll see if that comes to fruition or not. I know with early voting, I did early voting the other day. There were a lot of people there, and it just seemed like there was a lot of interest. There's a lot of buzz. There's energy, but at the end of the day, just looking at everything, looking at, again, an Elon Musk owned X, where we actually have knowledge of stories that in 2020, if the regime who before, ran X, we may not even know anything about. So I think that there's just a lot of momentum that Trump and Vance both have built up. And I would not be surprised to see them pull it off and maybe at a sizable, comfortable lead at the end of the day.
Ryan, I want to get your final closing thoughts as well. But just to respond, like, to some of the stuff that you're saying, you're reminding me of a tweet I saw by our friend Dan McCarthy, always incisive guy. And he said something like, vibes mislead. It's neck and neck. Anything could happen. And I am conscious of that. I'm conscious of the intoxicating atmosphere of success, which has been so hard to come by on the right in the last 4 years. I mean, obviously, we've had wins, and there have been lots of genuine good things that have transpired over the past 4 years at the local level. But I remember this from the Obama years. It's demoralizing to be living under a presidential regime that not only isn't your team, yes, of course, it's the blue guys, and I like the red guys, but it's more that there was a first principles level, constitutional level dispute in the country. To have somebody in the Oval Office who just genuinely hates the premises of the country, and not just one person actually, but multiple people. I mean, Karine Jean-Pierre, Jen Psaki, Kamala Harris, Biden. This whole crew is just a gang of mobsters, as far as I'm concerned. And it's been very demoralizing to just have to hear from them every day. And so then when it starts to feel like, hey, maybe we're actually finally getting through to people, and maybe we'll have a different kind of attitude in the next 4 years, it gets very exciting. It's very easy to sort of think, well, yeah, we got this in the bag. I don't think we have it in the bag. I think that actually, whether Trump wins or whether Kamala wins, the rubber is about to meet the road in a very big way. Either we've sort of taken a good hard look at the 1619 left and the DEI agenda, and we've just thoroughly repudiated it in Trump, or we've actually plunked for it in Kamala, and then they will actually try to jail their political opponents in a much bigger way than they have yet. And things will I'm not saying that things will get violent, but things will get serious in a very grim way. I think either one of those results is going to be more decisive than perhaps we're worried about. I know the right's very worried about theft. I know that we're generally very worried about riots in the streets. I could be wrong. I hate making predictions, so I probably will be wrong. But I suspect that the country is kind of all rioted out. I think on the left, especially, like you can only get so excited about transgender surgeries for minors that you burn cop cars about it or whatever it is that they like to do. You can only do that for so long. The leadership is very eager to keep the threat of political violence hanging in the air. I don't sense that's something people at large in America are really excited about doing. It was always kind of an artificial neo-commie tactic. And I suspect we're about to see something of a decisive result one way or another. My hope and my slight inclination is that it's going to be a Trump victory.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the case, just given what Mike said about polling averages compared to the last two presidential elections, I think the only way you'd have a Kamala victory would be if the pollsters have now captured the shy Trump vote in their polling. And there are a bunch of reasons to suspect they really haven't yet, including from folks who work on this quite diligently. So that's possible. And so razor-thin Trump leads will evaporate with the closing strength, both sort of technically and politically, and get out the vote and all that efforts and longer honed skills of the Democrats. So that's certainly possible. I don't rule out a Kamala victory, but I would be very surprised given what I observe, and especially what we've observed in early voting. There are some really good sort of honest, diligent folks on Twitter, most of them anonymous, which is funny. Our friend Jeremy Carl is a connoisseur of these, so I followed his lead on this and who to look at. And it just, in places like Nevada, especially, it doesn't seem there's enough juice there, given the composition of the electorate and what it looked like in 2020, especially, the early results for some place like Clark County in Nevada, which is, if you know Nevada politics and demographics and distribution of population, it's really Clark County and then the rest of the state. Clark County being where Vegas is quite blue. And from the early voting numbers, it doesn't look like it's going to be a good day for Democrats. So I suspect that it will be an electoral college victory in the low 300s, Trump over Kamala. But anything can happen. And every election, I forget, Henry Olson's podcast, which I've plugged here before, Beyond the Polls, is always worth listening to. I encourage everyone to listen to it tomorrow. He records on Thursdays. I think it'll be Henry's closing prediction podcast. But he had a seasoned journalist, poll watcher type on last week. And he had this good metaphor, which is, the old metaphor that a man never crosses the same river more than once because the river waters are moving, et cetera. The electorate's the same way, especially in a huge country like this. So there's only so much comparative work you can do backcasting to 2020, so to speak. So, we could be wrong. We could be in for a late closing narrow Democratic victory, but I suspect not. And my hope is that it will be a narrow popular vote victory for Trump and a decisive electoral college victory. The reason I hope that is because there's already been, I think it was the Michigan Secretary of State today was saying there's some Dominion voting system glitch. So the worst case scenario would be a very narrow victory by the Democrats, given this, what everyone's observed is kind of a shift in momentum over recent weeks for Trump, and then a dragged out, contentious, litigated process for a week in which Kamala is eventually declared the winner. A chill goes down my spine at that result, not because we'll have a Democratic president, although I prefer the latter, the other alternative, but really because what it will do now being the second election in a row where half the country just throws up their hands and says, what the hell are we doing here? I can't trust any of this. So I hope for the sake of our civic health that there's a somewhat decisive Trump victory.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. He has this shtick, this line, too big to rig. And that if you're pro-Trump, you want that because you don't want the election to be yanked out from underneath him. But if you're pro-America, you want that because you just don't want the kind of damage that we sustained and inflicted upon ourselves 4 years ago. I don't know how many of those we can take. All right, cool. Well, sounds like we're all basically on the same page and therefore on the hook together for whatever happens when we three meet again.
If I may channel my wife, all of us being positive, including our friend Mike Anton, makes her very, very nervous.
It's a bad sign, I know.
Especially if Anton's positive. Uh-oh.
Yeah, then we're really in trouble. Well, okay, so we'll put this to bed so that we don't incriminate ourselves any further. But, well, when we three meet again, we'll have more, hopefully, conclusive information on this topic. For now, however, let's turn to a topic which will remain important, I would say, under both circumstances, whether Trump wins or Kamala wins. As I've kind of been hinting at, I think this whole media, free speech, platform, digital question, the sort of overlapping question of the new public square and how it's going to be administrated, is going to be one of the big questions of either a Trump administration or a Kamala administration, because it is the backdrop of so many of our other disputes and our inability to resolve some of these more vociferous arguments that we're having. And we got a little data point in that sordid story recently via the Daily Wire, although there have been a few other conservative personalities involved here. But it's the Daily Wire that has kind of, I think, brought most of this to light. There is a reporter, Nico Grant, for the New York Times, who sent out an email that looked very similar to a bunch of different right-wing commentators. I saw Tucker Carlson tweeting a screenshot of such an email, and I believe all the Daily Wire hosts got them. Definitely Andrew Klavan, no relation to me, got one. And so I'm reading off of that one, in which he says, I wanted to give Andrew Klavan an opportunity to comment for an upcoming article that takes a look at how political commentators have discussed the upcoming election on YouTube. We rely on data compiled by researchers at Media Matters for America, which we have independently verified. And goes on to say, we plan to include the following points. Media Matters identified 286 YouTube videos from 30 channels in May and August that contained election misinformation, including narratives that have been debunked or are not supported with credible evidence. Videos featuring Mr. Klavan that contained election misinformation about the outcome of the 2020 presidential race, and so on and so forth. So this is, for those that maybe are not as familiar with the players here, this is a joint effort on the part of the New York Times and this left-wing watchdog group. I almost said hate group, because they're sort of akin to the Southern Poverty Law Center. In the media sphere, they are basically what the Southern Poverty Law Center is in the legal sphere. That is, they are an incredibly biased and tendentious organization that poses as a watchdog group, takes for granted a far left set of assumptions about what constitutes hate speech, what constitutes misinformation, and having already foreclosed those sorts of questions, then tags right-wing commentators and journalists with all of these nasty buzzwords so that platforms like YouTube will take them down. As far as Media Matters goes, this has been a known quantity in the right-wing media sphere for years and years. I mean, when I first started working at Claremont, one of the first things that happened is that Media Matters came out with a big old hit piece on my dad and a few other people. And this is sort of taken for granted. And there's a certain extent to which, if you haven't been tagged by Media Matters, then it's like you have to work on that. There's like a point of pride to have at one point been clipped by Media Matters. And they will often take clips from shows that are pretty good. And then the host will be like, yes, I do agree with this. So that is sort of like a known quantity. Everybody who knows Media Matters knows that they are a dishonest outfit. It's also true to an extent that the New York Times is well known as a dishonest outfit, but there are many, many more people who still take the New York Times as a kind of supposedly unbiased source of information. And there are still reporters at the New York Times who do good work and bring good reporting, even despite the overall leftist cast of the paper. What I think is significant here is this just really explicit collusion between the two. This is a story based on taking Media Matters as if it were data. Like they claim to have independently verified this stuff, but really what they're saying is, based on the premise that Media Matters is correct, both in its definition of misinformation and in its attitudes about what should happen to people who do misinformation, that they should be deplatformed and suppressed and so forth. We intend to run a story giving the New York Times imprimatur to this tendentious attack that has been levied on not just the Daily Wire, not just Carlson, but if you name a major right-wing pundit or commentator, they've probably got a page on Media Matters. So we wanted to highlight this and talk a little bit about it in the context of our kind of ongoing media battles. We don't yet know. I don't think any of the people contacted are going to give a comment to the Times. But the intent here is obviously for YouTube to be pressured into taking some of these accounts down or suppressing them more than they already do. What do you guys think will come of all of this? Do you feel that this will be successful? Or
Yeah, I think it's probably a little too late. I don't know what the leadership at YouTube is like or what they think of the current moment or their role in it. I mean, I know they think their role in it is to suppress true disinformation or misinformation. But I think, on the weekend eve of the election, I think they might judiciously judge, that's sort of repetitive, but they might make the judgment that to run with this in some big way right now and demonetize 30 different accounts, or even half, to say they decide it's 15, would be self-defeating and damage their reputation in a significant way. On the other hand, I mean, YouTube is really the only game in town, functionally speaking, for online streaming in a way that lets people make a decent amount of money from doing this sort of content. So they may also make the judgment the predicates have been laid by the paper of record, and we have to act on this. In any event, I think any action really will be a scandal and will reverberate into our politics and policy debates. So I suspect there may be some risk-averse executives at YouTube and its owners that will cause some pause in really acting on this. And we should state it's from the ones I saw from Ben Shapiro, from your father, Andrew Spencer, from Michael Knowles, from Tucker. It's not like, a lot of their categorized quote unquote misinformation is not people saying the 2020 election was stolen. It's them commenting that it was rigged, that the rules were changed to enable more more mail-in balloting and vote harvesting, that the suppression of information like the Hunter Biden laptop, favored Democrats, sort of run-of-the-mill stuff in the sense that it's really not verifiable by any expert anywhere that it can be misinformation. It's a common sense judgment about the scrum of information in the lead up to 2020, many of which were admitted by left-wing media. So it's sort of fundamentally dishonest at that level, and that's Media Matters' MO, is to, whether consciously or not, to be dishonest and to put their thumb on the scales of the free exchange of ideas and label one side illegitimate because false or debunked, and the other side on the side of the angels and truth and real science. So that's sort of the whole backdrop of it. I hope it kind of fizzles, and I suspect there's a good chance it might.
I think this really goes back to, what is the 2024 election? I mean, have things changed enough? Have things realigned enough where YouTube, their board of directors, says no? So this will kind of be an interesting test case in terms of like, how far are we actually down kind of the realignment path? And just to go back to Media Matters, I mean, David Brock, former right-wing guy, supposedly, absolute left-wing hack now, goes after conservatives all the time. I think the SPLC, Southern Poverty Law Center, that's a great kind of linkage to that. It's the same kind of stuff. Basically, hey, let's not try to debate the right. Let's actually try to just get them canceled, thrown in jail, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the same playbook, the same tactic that a lot of those organizations and institutions have been using for quite a long time. But again, with this kind of, vibe shift, however much you want to call it, I just think that there's too many good guys out there. There's too many guys who have podcasts who know this information. I just have a hard time seeing that legitimacy that is required of this kind of thing for it to actually work, that it's there anymore. People think of our institutions today, and I think they tend to think they're very corrupt. Look at Congress's rating, and I know it's been like that for a long time, but across the board, people have just lost any sense of legitimacy in a lot of our leading institutions. So I just think that this kind of bravado almost from Media Matters they just really kind of don't know what time it is. And I think it will fail if it's not, YouTube putting a stop to it. It's people kind of standing up and saying, no, we're not going to take this anymore, and doing something about it themselves, whether that's start something new, campaigning. You look at Bud Light, you look at Target and some of institutions that have kind of felt the full force and brunt of people saying no. You do see people standing up now, I think, in a way that maybe if they did in 2016 or even before, it just didn't work, but it seems to be working now. So again, I would be surprised if this worked. It seems kind of suicidal at this point, but you never know. I mean, this may be just some last ditch effort, last gasp to try to take the reins back.
That's well said. I mean, I think it's important for people to understand, we rail against big tech so much, and there's a lot that big tech has to answer for in the person of Mark Zuckerberg and the CEOs of some of these major companies. And we on this podcast have done plenty of talking about how many of these Silicon Valley guys are or have in the past been in the tank for powerful interests in Washington, most of which are on the left, and so on and so forth. But it's easy then to get into the mindset of these major tech platforms are already lost causes. And so there's really nothing for the New York Times there's nothing more that the New York Times could want out of a platform like YouTube, we imagine, than what they already do and the censorship that they already have. And we all remember the Twitter debacle around the Hunter Biden laptop story. And we just think like these tech platforms are already completely captured. But one of the things that we've seen with Elon is that game is not over. Like that is not a foregone conclusion, even in the mainstream tech platform arena. And YouTube and Google are two places where it's definitely far from a foregone conclusion that these are always just going to be regime apparatus arms in hock to big censorship that operate according to these kind of European quote unquote disinformation principles. And if that were a foregone conclusion, then people like old Nico at the New York Times wouldn't feel the desperate need to pressure places like YouTube into adopting the media matters standard for what counts as disinformation and what should be suppressed and what should be censored. So they know at the New York Times that this is actually a winnable fight for us. In other words, it's at least possible to sway platforms like YouTube away from outright full-on censorship using the kinds of pressure, Mike, that you're talking about. Before you even get into the question of, well, is Rumble a viable alternative? What about X as a video platform? There are all of these other, parallel economy projects that I think deserve our attention and our investment in time. But that shouldn't preclude us from kind of still paying some attention to how these bigger platforms operate, because there are still people there that are trying to navigate the various pressures on them. They haven't just totally decided like we belong to the Democrat Party. There's a lot of powerful interests trying to motivate you to censor, the material. For example, COVID skepticism. We've seen that those interests are also working on Facebook/Meta, and that in general they've been very successful. But that doesn't mean that like that fight is over. And I actually think that this whole episode, if there's anything it shows that's really interesting, it's that they're still trying to get YouTube to obey them more, which means that YouTube isn't currently just fully decided on obeying them. So conservatives are underdogs in this space, no question, but we're less underdogs than we were a year ago. And feasibly, we could actually like gain more ground there as well, which is important for us to realize, so we don't just kind of give up and say the world is against us. That closes that book. Then, Ryan, you are at the Sheriff's Fellowship right now, calling in with a report from the ground. The Sheriff's Fellowship is one of the really cool things that we just started doing fairly recently. And I don't know if everybody knows what it is. And I also understand that you've been having a really great time teaching there. So could you just sort of fill us in on how things are going out there and what you're up to?
Yeah, thanks, Spencer. It's the closing day of our Sheriff's Fellowship. our newest fellowship. So as most of our listeners know, we've been teaching for a long time. It's a core part of what we do in these summer fellowships. Now we have speechwriters and sheriffs, our two newer ones, into the fall. So Publius was our first, really founded when we were, for early career folks in media, journalism, politics, policy, basically the national political conversation in various ways. Lincoln Fellowship comes after Publius. It's a little shorter because we have folks from mid-career doing a lot of the same work. The John Marshall Fellowship, which is for lawyers headed to federal clerkships or in between federal clerkships for the most part, because they end up being judges and administration lawyers and law professors. And then speechwriters is self-explanatory. That was a couple weeks ago in Washington, D.C. And then sheriffs, which this is now our fourth sheriffs fellowship. We have 13 sheriffs here for about 5 days. And all of our programs are a kind of crash course in American constitutional principle, how it's evolved over time and the different parties and critics of it through the progressive era and up until the modern fights between conservatism and liberalism, so that we can help all of our different constituents in these programs understand where we're at, how we got here, and what to do about it. So that's where we are. We're at the last day of the Sheriff's Fellowship, as I mentioned, and I'm teaching in about 10 minutes, one of the kind of closing session, which is an open field. But I always love to teach this great Madison essay from 1792 called On Property. And I think it speaks to a lot of the things we've just been discussing about this debate over misinformation and how we should understand it in terms of free speech and rights and all the rest. So I'll just read the opening paragraphs from this great essay. I encourage everyone to read On Property by Madison annually at least, and to ponder it. It really encapsulates not all, but most of the foundational arguments about what government ought to do and why natural rights are important to protect, and really what American justice ought to look like, at least at the sort of federal constitutional level, and then all the way down in its different ways. So Madison says, this term, that is property, in its particular application means that dominion which one man claims and exercises over the external things of the world in exclusion of every other individual. That he quotes that. It's probably from Webster. In its larger and juster meaning, it embraces everything to which a man may attach a value and have a right, and which leaves to everyone else the like advantage. In the former sense, that is the not the larger and juster meaning, just the property sense, a physical property sense, it means a man's land or merchandise or money is called his property. In the latter sense, that is to say, in the larger and juster meaning that he just talked about, a man has a property in his opinions and the free communication of them. He has a property of peculiar value in his religious opinions and in the profession and practice dictated by them. He has a property very dear to him in the safety and liberty of his person. He has an equal property in the free use of his faculties and free choice of the objects on which to employ them. And this is the real money quote of the whole essay, although there's lots of good stuff after this. In a word, a man is said to have a right to his property. He may be equally said to have a property in his rights. So that's, in a nutshell, the foundation of the teaching in all of our fellowship programs. A lot of it encapsulated here in Madison's pithy prose. The sheriffs, are this weird but wonderful American phenomenon, half politician, half law enforcement. They're kind of the front lines of the protection of rights of Americans. And so we like to close with this essay to remind them to read it and reflect on it and translate its terms into modern idiom as they do their jobs. Because yes, they protect life and liberty in the criminal law and their execution of it at the hands-on ground level, but also they're civic leaders, and they ought to remind people that they're out there protecting their rights in a more capacious sense. And we launched this fellowship after 2020, when we noticed that sheriffs were both on the front lines of public order in the meltdown after George Floyd, and then they were also in the front lines of a bunch of COVID restrictions. Lots of sheriffs across the country told their local communities, we're not going to arrest you for holding church services. And so in their core, a lot of them understood this basic Madisonian view of rights, which is the peculiar value of people's religious opinions and in the profession and practice dictated by them. Well, that right there in COVID shutdowns of churches, you have it sort of in a pointed way. And a lot of sheriffs were guardians of the people's rights on that topic and others. And so we're excited by it. The sheriffs really love it. This is our biggest class yet. It's kind of achieved liftoff. It's hard to recruit sheriffs. half of them are running for re-election right around this time every year. And they're busy guys. They run, mostly guys. We haven't had a woman sheriff yet, but there are a few out there. So we had, a class of 8, then a class of 6 where a couple had to drop off last minute, and then a class of 8 again, and now a class of 13. So we hope going forward we can gather with 13 or 14 sheriffs every November or late October and continue to do the work we've always done, which is to teach the principles of the American founding.
Yeah, the first time I think I really became acquainted with the power of that essay was in 2020 when the riots were tearing up American cities, and Nicole Hannah-Jones said something to the effect of, well, we're coming for your property, but you're coming for our lives. In other words, we're justified. It's just a little property. So what does it matter if we burn down some storefronts when whatever Black people are dying en masse at the hands of racist cops, or whatever her sort of argument was. And it was in that moment that I returned to that essay and realized what a really sick way of looking at things that is an anti-American, not just because, it's sort of casually dismissive toward people that have lost, in some cases, businesses they've built up over years, but that the American way of understanding that is that those businesses contain the cumulative soul almost of the people who have poured their effort into them. There's this sense in which things that you work on and that you accrue to yourself become like an extension of yourself. And if somebody can just take them from you, it's really only one very small logical step to the conclusion that they can take you for their own purposes if you get in their way, and they can execute you should they so choose without due process of law. And I think we saw in 2020 that those two thoughts, I can take your property and I can take your life, are indeed very much of a piece. Madison wasn't just repeating conventional wisdom when he made that argument. He was actually entering into a longstanding dispute over what property is and what counts as property, and affirming, I think rightly, that in order to be philosophically rigorous about the right to property, you have to extend the definition of property to all those things over which we have dominion, including ourselves and our opinions and our lives. It's a great essay, and it's, as Ryan says, 1,200 words long, if that.
Yeah, no, it is a great essay. I was a Lincoln Fellow, by the way, this past year, so vouch for the program. I mean, great program. If you haven't done it, haven't done Publius, Lincoln, sheriffs, John Marshall, speechwriters, please, please, please put in your resume. They're obviously very competitive programs. Not many slots open, but it was just an amazing experience. And just the people that you'll be connected with, too. Can't say enough about my class, and I know previous classes say the same thing. And just with going back to Madison, too, I know talking about rights is kind of passe, especially on their new right now. But really, he does capture kind of the American spirit, the American understanding of these things that really hasn't been, replaced with anything, I think, in my mind, that's, even 50% that is, really captures what's going on there. The importance of these things to human life, to good life, to happiness. The twin ends, as the Declaration says, safety and happiness, the alpha and the omega. I think Jaffa used that language. Gary Jaffa, our intellectual forefather here at the Claremont Institute. And yeah, so I would be with Ryan and say, if you haven't read that essay, if you've never read it, please read it. And if you have, read it again. It just is really, a core understanding of America, the founding, and where we want to get to again.
Hear, hear. All right, I'm going to go read it again. But first, we have to close out this podcast by thanking you all for listening to the Roundtable. If you like what we do and you're interested in our work, you can find out more by checking out our sister publication, the Claremont Review of Books, at ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com. You can go to our website, AmericanMind.org, where we will be pumping out top-tier election coverage down to the last minute of the election and perhaps beyond. Who knows? You can learn more about everything we do by visiting our website at Claremont.org. You can donate to support us at Claremont.org/donate. And you can check out our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. Thanks to our production and engineering crew, the brothers G, Jake, and Ryan Gannon. And thanks to you all for listening. We will talk to you next week.